8,000 years ago, in the hills of what's now Georgia, someone sealed a jar of fermented grapes and buried it in the earth. They probably didn't think much of it. A jar, a harvest, a ritual, something to feed the dead, or thank the living. They walked away, and the earth closed over it, and the world moved on for 8,000 years. That jar rewrote the history of wine. And what came next isn't the story you've been told. Because you've probably heard at some point in your life that people in the past drank wine because water wasn't safe. That in the dirty, plague-ridden Middle Ages, alcohol was the only thing standing between a peasant and cholera. It's in documentaries, it's in novels, it's in half the textbooks you ever read. And it's wrong. Almost every part of it is wrong. The truth is stranger, older, and far more human. And the evidence for it was buried in that Georgian jar and in 100 other places we're going to visit. By the end of this video, you'll know why medieval people actually drank wine. You'll know why a French monk gets credit for inventing something he spent his whole life trying to stop. You'll know about the American bug that nearly killed European wine forever, and the American roots that saved it. You'll know about the law that banned wine and the loophole that made it explode. And you'll know how, on a spring afternoon in Paris in 1976, a small tasting rearranged the entire wine world in the space of a few hours. It's a story that starts in a Stone Age village. It runs through the tombs of pharaohs, the dining rooms of Greek philosophers, the cellars of medieval monks, the vineyards of 19th century France, and the basements of Prohibition-era America. It survives empires falling. It survives a plague that nearly wipes it off the earth. It survives an entire superpower trying to erase it. And it starts with the jar. The site was called Gadakrili Gora, a small Stone Age village on a Green River valley about an hour south of what's now Tbilisi. The people who lived there decorated their pottery with clusters of grapes. Their hillsides were carpeted with wild vines. And in their homes, they kept enormous clay jars, some of the largest ever made in the ancient Near East. Those jars weren't just storage. They were fermentation vessels, aging vessels, and serving vessels rolled into one. The same design is still used in Georgia today. They're called cuvevri. 8,000 vintages later, that country still uses the same clay bellies to make wine. Georgia has more than 500 native grape varieties. It calls itself the birthplace of wine. And for a long time, nobody could prove it. Then a team of chemists tested a scrap of Neolithic pottery from Gadakrili Gora and found tartaric acid, the chemical signature of grapes, preserved for 8,000 years. That single fragment pushed the birth of grape wine back by 1,000 years. Older than the wheel, older than writing, older than the pyramids by 3,000 years. Before humans built cities, before they smelted metal, before they wrote down a single thought, they had already figured out how to make wine, and they'd already fallen in love with it. But here's where it gets interesting. Georgia may hold the record for grape wine, but it isn't the oldest alcoholic drink humans ever made. That title belongs to China. In a village called Jiahu, in the Yellow River Valley of Henan Province, archaeologists found pottery even older. 9,000 years old. And when they tested the residue, they found something even more surprising. A mixed fermented drink made from rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, with a hint of wild grape. It wasn't wine as we know it. It was something in between mead, beer, and wine. But it proved something important. Fermentation wasn't invented once, in one place, by one clever person. It was discovered independently over and over across the ancient world. Every human society that grew fruit or grain eventually figured out that if you left it alone in a warm room, magic happened. Then, around 4100 BC, in a cave in Armenia called Arini I, someone took the next step. Archaeologists found a full winery inside that cave. A grape press, a fermentation vat, drinking cups, even the pips of crushed grapes still lying in the press. It's the oldest wine production facility ever discovered. And it wasn't built for casual drinking, it sat next to a graveyard. The wine, they think, was made for the dead. That's the first pattern to understand about wine. From its very first days, it was never just a drink, it was ritual, it was medicine, it was currency, it was religion. It was, above all, something worth burying with your dead so they'd have it in the next world. Which brings us to Mesopotamia, and this is where the first big misconception falls apart. If you picture ancient Sumerians and Babylonians, you probably picture them drinking wine. They didn't. Not often. Mesopotamia was beer country. The climate between the Tigris and Euphrates was perfect for barley and lousy for grapes, so the Sumerians brewed beer at industrial scale. They paid their workers in it. They wrote hymns to the beer goddess Ninkasi. Nearly 40% of their grain harvest went into beer production. Wine in Mesopotamia was a luxury import. It came down the rivers from the northern mountains of the Zagros range. It cost a fortune. It was kept in the cellars of kings. The ruler of Lagash, a man named Urukagina, had a special storeroom for what his scribes called jars of mountain wine. That's wine as status symbol, wine as flex. And that pattern, wine as the drink of the powerful, would echo across the next 4,000 years. Nowhere was that pattern more obvious than in Egypt. The Egyptians drank beer, rivers of it. Pyramid workers were paid in it. But their pharaohs, their gods, their priests, they drank wine. And they took it seriously. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he found something no one expected. 26 sealed clay wine jars buried with the boy king around 1323 BC. And on the shoulders of those jars were written labels. The year of the harvest, the name of the vineyard, the name of the head vintner, and an assessment of quality. Good, very good, excellent. Modern chemists tested residue from 3 of them and found something else remarkable. One held red wine, one held white, one held a rare fortified wine called Chardonnay. 3 different styles positioned carefully around the sarcophagus for what appears to have been a resurrection ritual. Those are the oldest wine labels in the world. 3,300 years ago, an Egyptian scribe was doing what a French vintner does today. Naming the estate, recording the vintage, certifying the quality. The idea of wine as a named, tracked, traceable product is that old. In Mesopotamia, wine proved you were powerful. In Egypt, it proved you were eternal. And in Greece, it would prove something stranger, that you could control yourself. And the Greeks would leave behind one habit that helps destroy the biggest myth in this entire story. Respectable Greek drinking culture generally treated undiluted wine as barbaric. At the heart of Greek civilization was an event called the symposium. The word literally means drinking together. Men would recline on couches in a private room, and slaves would carry in an enormous mixing bowl called a crater. Into that bowl went the wine, and then, into that same bowl, went water. Sometimes twice as much water as wine, sometimes 3 times, sometimes 5 times. Drinking wine unmixed was called drinking Scythian style. Named after the northern tribes the Greeks considered savages. To drink wine straight was to invite madness. It was uncivilized. It was, in the Greek mind, animal. So the most sophisticated society of the ancient world took its most prized drink, a wine that could reach 16% alcohol, aged in leather and clay until it was thick and dark, and cut it with water before every sip. The man in charge of the ratios was called the symposiarch. He was elected at the start of the night. He decided how much water went in and how many cups each guest could drink. He was essentially the world's first sommelier. Now hold that image for a moment. A Greek gentleman, mixing wine with water. Not because the water was dangerous, because the wine was. Because civilization, in the Greek mind, was the act of taming a wild drink with a safe one. That habit is the first crack in the myth we're going to break. Because if the ancient world's most influential drinkers were pouring water into their wine on purpose and doing it for 1,500 years, then the idea that later Europeans avoided water out of terror doesn't hold up. The habit of mixing wine and water didn't die with the Greeks. It traveled into Rome, into monasteries, into medieval kitchens, and we're going to catch it there in the very texts that are supposed to prove the opposite. For now, though, Rome is rising, and Rome is about to turn wine into something we'd recognize. By the 2nd century BC, the Romans had built the first true wine industry in human history. They ranked their vineyards, they named their estates, they aged their bottles, they wrote reviews. Pliny the Elder, Roman naturalist, admiral, and the author of a 37-volume encyclopedia called Natural History, spent an entire volume ranking the best wines of the empire. He identified the great growths. He argued about terroir. He complained about fakes. He gave us the phrase in vino veritas, in wine, truth. At the top of his list sat one wine above all others, Falernian. It came from the volcanic slopes of Mount Falernus in Campania in southern Italy. It was aged for 15 to 20 years in clay amphorae. It oxidized in that time to a color somewhere between amber and dark brown. It was strong, around 15 or 16% alcohol, and Romans obsessed over legendary vintages the way modern collectors obsess over Bordeaux. The most famous vintage of all was the Opimian, made in 121 BC in the year of the consul Lucius Opimius. That wine was still being poured at dinner parties nearly 2 centuries later. Long past drinkable, by Pliny's own admission, they drank it anyway, because it was legend, and the moment a wine becomes legend, someone starts faking it. A black market for counterfeit Falernian sprang up almost immediately. The physician Galen wrote around 180 AD that there was no way all the Falernian on sale in Rome could possibly be real. Wine fraud, it turns out, is nearly as old as wine. But Rome did something bigger than rank its own vineyards. Rome exported viticulture. Every legion that marched into Gaul, Iberia, Germania, Britannia, they carried grape cuttings. They planted vines. They taught the locals how to prune Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhone, the Rhine, Rioja, the Douro. Most of the great wine regions of modern Europe were first planted or first commercialized by Rome. The map of European wine today is essentially a map of the Roman Empire. Not everyone loved that. In 92 AD, the Emperor Domitian panicked that too much land was being turned over to vineyards and not enough to grain. So he issued an imperial decree. No new vineyards in Italy. Half the vines in the provinces were to be ripped out. It was one of the most sweeping agricultural interventions in ancient history. It lasted almost 200 years. Emperor Probus finally repealed it in 280 AD. And the moment he did, farmers replanted with a vengeance. 13 years before Domitian's decree, nature had already delivered a version of the same devastation. In 79 AD, Vesuvius erupted. The ash that buried Pompeii also buried the great Falernian vineyards. The volcanic soil, once cooled, would eventually become one of the richest wine-growing regions on Earth. But for a generation, the empire's greatest wine simply stopped. Rome would fall, slowly. And when it did, most of the ancient world's institutions collapsed with it. The roads, the trade networks, the libraries, the plumbing. But wine survived. And it survived because of one specific group of people working inside stone walls who had a religious reason to keep the vines alive. The monks. When the Western Empire crumbled in the 5th century, viticulture across Europe should have died. In many places, it did. What kept the industry alive was Christianity. Every mass required wine. Every monastery needed a supply. And so from Iberia to the Rhineland to the vineyards of Gaul, monks kept planting. They kept pruning. They kept fermenting, quietly, methodically, generation after generation. And then, in Burgundy, they did something extraordinary. In a place called Clos de Vougeot, Cistercian monks walked the same hillside for 200 years, and they took notes. They noted which corners of the vineyard ripened first, which produced the sweetest juice, which handled a wet spring, which soil grew a wine that could age. They mapped it, plot by plot, over generations of dead monks. And out of those centuries of quiet observation came an idea that still governs the wine world today. The idea of terroir. The theory that a single hillside, a single strip of earth, has a taste all its own. That the same grape, planted 20 meters away, will make a different wine. The Cistercians proved it, one vintage at a time, with nothing but shovels and patience. The monks did more than preserve wine. Their records, and the medical texts they copied and kept alive, also preserve the evidence that destroys the biggest myth in wine's whole story. That medieval people drank wine because water wasn't safe. You've heard it in documentaries, you've heard it in novels, you've read it in textbooks, that in the filthy, plague-ridden Middle Ages, alcohol was safer than water, so peasants and priests alike stayed mildly drunk from morning to night just to stay alive. Here's the problem. Historians have been trying to kill that story for decades, and it just won't die, so let's kill it properly. Medical writers of the Middle Ages didn't warn people off water. They wrote whole chapters on it. A Byzantine physician named Paul of Aegina, in the 7th century, wrote that water is the most useful drink there is, and that the best water is clear, odorless, and pleasant to swallow. 2 centuries later, a European abbot advised drinking from a clear well or the current of a transparent brook. Not, he added, from a muddy cistern. The Salernitan Rule of Health, one of the most widely read medical guides of the medieval period, recommended drinking from cool springs and suggested rainwater was even better. 12th century doctors treated hangovers by prescribing water. Dozens of surviving texts say the same thing. Medieval people didn't distrust water. They ranked it. They knew a clear brook from a fetid pond. They knew a mountain spring from a stagnant swamp. They built cities near wells. They ran aqueducts. They boiled water they were unsure about. And when they drank wine, and they drank plenty of it, they very often mixed it with water. Just like the Greeks had, 1,500 years earlier. The habit never died. It just moved indoors into monasteries and manor halls. So, no. Medieval people did not generally replace water with wine because all water was unsafe. Wine was preferred for other reasons. Because it tasted better. Because it carried calories. Because it warmed the body, according to the humoral medicine of the era. Because it marked status. Because it was the blood of Christ. Because it was pleasure. Because it was ritual. Not because it was survival. The myth is largely a 19th century invention. A romantic story about a filthy medieval past that made the modern world look enlightened by comparison. It's been repeated so many times it feels true, but dig into the actual sources, the actual medieval manuscripts, the actual medical texts, the actual archaeology, and the story falls apart. Wine was the drink of civilization. Water was the drink of survival. Medieval people drank both, and they knew the difference. The water myth was created by modern storytellers. Champagne's greatest legend was created by marketers. And it centers on a monk who has been credited for 300 years with something he didn't do, and didn't want to do. You know the tale. A blind French monk, sometime in the late 1600s, working in a cool cellar in the Champagne region, accidentally makes the first sparkling wine. He takes a sip. His eyes go wide. He calls out to his fellow monks, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars." Beautiful story. Almost none of it is true. Dom Pierre Perignon was a real person. He was born in 1638. He was a Benedictine monk. He became the cellar master at the Abbey of Hauvillers in 1668, and he ran that cellar until his death in 1715. He was a brilliant winemaker. He introduced strong English glass to hold pressure. He advocated for corks. He blended grapes from different vineyards with a precision nobody in the region had used before. He was a genuine innovator. He also spent his entire career trying to get rid of bubbles, because in the 17th century, bubbles in wine weren't a feature. They were a flaw. Champagne winters were so cold that fermentation would stall in the fall, then restart in the spring when the wine was already in the bottle. The result was carbonation nobody wanted, and bottles of the era couldn't handle the pressure. Picture the cellar worker walking into a stone room in April, lantern in hand, iron mask strapped over his face, listening. One bottle blows. Its shrapnel triggers the next. and a whole cellar can go up in a chain reaction of shattering glass. They called the stuff le vin du diable, the devil's wine. Dom Perignon's actual job was to make that stop, and he mostly succeeded. When he died, the inventory of his cellar showed hundreds of barrels of still wine. Not a single bottle of sparkling. The line about tasting the stars? Never happened. Historians have traced its first appearance to a French print advertisement in the late 19th century. It's marketing. The story of the blind monk with the miraculous palate never happened either. That legend came from a later monk named Dom Grussard, who wrote a glorified account of Hautevillers in 1821 to boost the abbey's prestige. He essentially invented the myth from scratch. The man who actually documented the method for making sparkling wine wasn't a French monk. He was an English scientist named Christopher Merret. In 1662, 6 years before Dom Perignon ever set foot in Champagne, Merret presented a paper to the Royal Society in London. He explained exactly how to make wine sparkle by adding sugar to a bottle and letting it ferment a second time. He'd figured it out. And the English were already drinking sparkling champagne, imported still from France in barrels, then bottled and re-fermented in London cellars, decades before Dom Perignon supposedly discovered it. And the champagne we drink today, the crystal-clear luxury on the table, is largely the invention of a French widow. Her name was Barbé Nicole Ponsardin. She was 27 when her husband died. She took over the family wine business at a moment when a woman running a company in France was almost unheard of, and around 1816 she perfected a technique called riddling, a method of gently rotating bottles to collect the yeast in the neck so it could be removed. That's what turned champagne from a cloudy, sludgy, sediment-filled drink into what you pour today. History remembers her as the widow Clicquot. She did it, not the monk. If you're catching the pattern here, it's this. Wine has always attracted mythology. Because wine matters. Because it's tied to religion, to nation, to status, to identity. Because it's the drink humans put in the ground with their dead 8,000 years ago and still put on their tables tonight. Every era rewrites its story. Champagne's catastrophe was exaggerated. The disaster that came next was terrifyingly real, and it very nearly ended wine. The 1860s, southern France. Imagine a farming family walking out into the vineyard one morning to check the vines their grandfather planted. The leaves are yellow. The grapes are shriveled. They pull one plant up by the roots, and the roots come apart in their hands. Soft, rotted, black. They don't know what has done this. Nobody does. And the same thing is happening on the next farm. And the next. The disease spread. Slowly at first, then everywhere. Bordeaux by the end of the decade. Burgundy soon after. The Loire, the Rhône. Region by region, some of the most famous vineyards in the world simply died. Wine production collapsed. Farmers went bankrupt. Villages emptied. In some parts of southern France, the local economy never fully came back. In 1868, a French botanist named Jules-Émile Planchon finally identified the killer. A tiny insect, yellow, almost invisible to the naked eye, called phylloxera. And it wasn't European. It came from America. Nobody was sure how it got there. Probably on the roots of American grapevines that European scientists had imported for study in the 1850s. Wherever it had come from, it was catastrophic. Phylloxera fed on the roots of European grapevines, and the vines had no defense. In America, native vines had evolved alongside the insect for millions of years. They'd developed a way to seal off wounds. They shrugged it off. But the noble European Vitis vinifera, the species behind every great wine in history, had never seen the pest. And it was defenseless. Within 30 years, phylloxera destroyed roughly 2/3 of France's vineyards, roughly 2.5 million hectares. Across Europe, the number climbed toward 6 million hectares. Only the Irish potato blight had done worse damage to 19th century European agriculture. Growers tried everything. They flooded the vineyards. They injected the soil with carbon disulfide. They buried live toads under the vines, hoping the toads would somehow absorb the poison. Nothing worked. The solution, when it finally came, was strange and beautiful and deeply ironic. Graft the vines. Take a European grape variety, Cabernet, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, whatever you wanted, and physically fuse the top of the vine onto the root of an American species. The American root, immune to phylloxera. The European scion, producing the wine everyone loved. Two plants joined at the wound, working as one. It worked. By the 1890s, growers across France, then Spain, then Italy, then Germany, were tearing out their dying vines and replanting them on grafted American roots. It saved the industry. It saved the wines. And it means that the vast majority of European wine you have ever tasted, from a first-growth Bordeaux to a supermarket Chianti, was grown on an American root. There is one country in the wine world that phylloxera largely spared: Chile. Isolated by the Andes on one side, the Pacific on another, the Atacama Desert to the north, and Patagonia to the south, Chile's old vineyards escaped the plague. Its old vines, planted from European cuttings in the 19th century, still grow on their own original roots. It's one of the few places on Earth where you can drink wine made from pre-phylloxera vines. And one grape variety, the Carmenere, was thought to be extinct in Bordeaux after the blight. Decades later, botanists visiting Chile realized that many of the vines Chilean farmers were calling Merlot were actually the lost Carmenere, grown from cuttings taken to South America before the disease hit. The grape had survived, 5,000 miles from home. Wine had almost died. And America, which had caused the disaster, provided the cure. Nature almost destroyed wine once. 50 years later, the United States tried to finish the job deliberately. On January 17, 1920, the Volstead Act took effect. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors across the United States. The temperance movement had won. And the American wine industry, which had been growing for decades, California vineyards, upstate New York, Ohio, Virginia, collapsed almost overnight. Some of the oldest family wineries in America pulled up their vines by hand and burned them because the grape they'd built their lives on was suddenly worthless. Almost overnight. Almost. Because whoever wrote the Volstead Act left 3 loopholes wide enough to drive a wagon through. The first was called Section 29. It allowed the head of any American household to produce up to 200 gallons of non-intoxicating fruit juice per year at home for personal consumption. That's about 1,000 bottles. The IRS, in a ruling issued later that year, quietly clarified that this fruit juice could, in fact, be wine. Home winemaking became legal by accident. The second exemption was sacramental wine. Priests and rabbis could legally possess and serve wine for religious purposes. In cities like San Francisco, brand new congregations sprang up out of nowhere, led by rabbis nobody had ever heard of, all needing bulk shipments of kosher wine. Actual Jewish organizations complained about the fraud publicly. Nobody stopped it. The third exemption was medicinal wine, and its bigger cousin, medicinal whiskey. Doctors could write prescriptions for alcohol. Over 6 million such prescriptions were written during Prohibition. Walgreens grew from 20 stores to over 500 during the ban, partly on the strength of prescription filling. Here's the punchline. California vineyard acreage went from 300,000 acres in 1920, the year wine was banned, to over 570,000 acres by 1927. It nearly doubled. During Prohibition, grape harvests doubled. Grape prices soared. Because Americans denied their wine at the store, made it in their basements, in staggering quantities. Some enterprising producers even sold what they called wine bricks, dried compressed blocks of grape juice concentrate. They came wrapped in labels that carried a very specific warning. Do not add water and sugar. Do not store in a jug. Do not leave in a dark place for 21 days. Because if you do, they warned solemnly, the mixture will turn into wine. The bricks flew off the shelves. Prohibition still gutted the commercial wine industry. Hundreds of wineries closed permanently. Vineyards that had been growing delicate wine grapes were ripped out and replanted with thick-skinned shipping grapes. Tough, bland, terrible for drinking. Once the ban lifted in December of 1933, American wine had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. It took 40 years. Prohibition damaged American wine for 40 years. Then one blind tasting rebuilt its reputation in a single afternoon. May 24, 1976. An English wine merchant named Stephen Spurrier, who ran a small shop and a wine school in Paris, organized a tasting for the American bicentennial. It was supposed to be a fun little event, a publicity stunt. He and his American colleague Patricia Gallagher had traveled to California a few months earlier and picked out 6 Chardonnays and 6 Cabernet Sauvignons. Nobody in France had ever heard of most of the wineries. Spurrier smuggled the bottles back to Paris in his luggage. He assembled a jury of 9 French wine authorities, the best of the best, a co-owner of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, the head of Château Gicourt, the sommelier of La Tour d'Argent. He included 4 white Burgundies and 4 red Bordeaux as controls, the greatest wines France could offer. The Californians were meant to be the underdogs, the sideshow, the cute joke about American ambition. The tasting was blind. The judges had no idea which was which. They swirled, they sniffed, they spat, they wrote scores on their cards, one by one in silence. And when Spurrier read the results out loud, the room went quiet in a very different way. The number 1 Chardonnay wasn't from Burgundy. It was from Napa Valley, Chateau Montelena, 1973. The number 1 Cabernet Sauvignon wasn't from Bordeaux. It was from Napa Valley, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, 1973. California had won both categories in a blind tasting, judged by the French. Only one journalist covered the event, a reporter for Time magazine named George Taber. He filed a story that ran a few weeks later under the headline, Judgment of Paris. It hit the international wire, then the front page of American papers, and within months, every wine buyer on earth knew the story. The idea that only Europe could make world-class wine cracked open in a single afternoon. Some of the French judges tried to walk it back. They said the California wines wouldn't age. They said if you retasted the same bottles in 30 years, the French would win. Stephen Spurrier held them to it. In 2006, on the 30th anniversary, he organized a retasting. Same wines. Now, 30-plus years old, California won again. This time, 4 of the top 5 reds were Californian. A wine called Ridge Montebello, 1971, took first place. And that's the real story. Not that wine was safer than water. Not that a blind monk invented champagne. Not that Europe alone knew how to make great wine. The real story is that for 8,000 years, humans have poured this drink for their gods, their rulers, their guests, and their dead. It has survived empires falling. It has survived a plague that nearly wiped it off the earth. It has survived the moral panic of an entire superpower trying to erase it. It has crossed every ocean humans could cross. It has adapted to every climate we could plant it in. And it is still, in the 21st century, the drink we pour when a meal matters, when a wedding is toasted, when a life is remembered. The jar in Georgia is still there. Archaeologists put it in a museum. But go into any cellar in Kakiti today, that same region, an hour south of Tbilisi, and you'll find modern Georgians doing exactly what their ancestors did 8,000 years ago. Grapes into clay, clay into the ground. Wait, uncork, pour, toast, 8,000 vintages. Same principle, same impulse, same drink. All of it belongs to a tradition at least 8,000 years old, one whose earliest surviving evidence still lies in the hills of Georgia, where somebody once sealed a jar of grapes and walked away, and had no idea they were writing the first page of a story that would outlast every empire on Earth. If this pulled you in, the history of coffee is waiting for you next. It starts with an Ethiopian goat herder and ends with a bean that shaped revolutions, empires, and every morning of your life. It's on the channel. Go watch it now, and subscribe if you want history done properly. One story a week. See you in the next one.